No, it's not.
What have you got there?
Got somebody growing corn or wheat or something. Where are you from in the US, Jim? Where are you from?
North Carolina.
North Carolina?
Yeah, not.
No, a genuine redneck.
And where are you? I know you teach at Columbia, and you're from England, yeah?
Originally, yeah, but I grew up mainly in Germany, so I sound more English than I actually am. But then, because the German university system sucks, I couldn't really make a career there. So came back to Britain.
My daughter is 16 and she's going to Columbia summer school this year.
No, right. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Despite all of the brouhaha.
Of course.
Good for you. Yeah, that's exactly the right attitude.
That's absolutely.
Yeah, seriously.
Stephen Engel, I'm the Chief North Asia Correspondent for Bloomberg Television, based in Hong Kong, but I used to be based here in Beijing for about 7 years. My first trip to Asia, living in Asia, was 34 years ago. I lived just up the road in Shenyang. So I lived a year in Shenyang, China in 1990, so I have a strong affinity to Dongbei. 我是东北人. And I probably have seen more of China in my 58 years than I have of America, and I'm going to be, obviously, the expert on this panel. Not. We have the experts here. Yes, I am American, but the conversation today is about the U.S. economy. We've all heard of it, but where is it going? That's the very overarching theme of this panel. Vera Songwei, I believe, will be joining us. You saw the names up here in just a minute. She is the chair of the board, Liquidity and Sustainability Facility of the UK, also tied to the Brookings Institute. And to my far left is Graham Allison, Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, of course, in the USA, former Assistant Secretary of Defense. I believe 1993 to 94 under Bill Clinton. Okay. And to my left, Adam Tooze, Director of the European Institute, Columbia University, USA. And if my daughter, you come across her in Columbia University this summer, go hard on her, okay? Please. That tuition is expensive.
Yeah. Daddy said.
Yeah, right. Okay, Bloomberg, we are all about data, right? So we have, of course, the data, which I rely on every day in my reporting on China. The U.S. economy, we all have seen the numbers. We've seen the relative strength, obviously, in the U.S. economy of late. I will quote S&P numbers. S&P in its latest economic outlook for the United States in the third quarter outlook today. Inflation remains stubborn, but pace will slow slightly. The base case GDP growth remains at 2.5% for 2024. Total of 125 basis point cuts by the Fed by the end of 2025. First cut coming in December. That is S&P. Bloomberg Intelligence says inflation will be above the 2% target through 2026. The U.S. economy, by the data and the projections, seems to continue to have that locomotive effect, and inflation will stay fairly high, perhaps above or right around 3%. It's above, obviously, the Fed target of 2%. Let's put these questions about what they expect for the U.S. economy this year to our two esteemed panelists. Who wants to start here? Adam, do you want to begin by what's your projection for the sustainability of U.S. growth this year?
We had this question in the global growth panel this morning, and I think it's just worth emphasizing how remarkable it is that we're talking about the US economy in these terms, right? I mean, give or take, could it be a little slower? Maybe it could. Could it be a little faster? Maybe it could. But we've just seen the most dramatic interest rate shock delivered to the US economy since 1979, and that was part of a global shock that was not as dramatic as 79. It was the most comprehensive interest rate shock. If you did have the misfortune of having to remortgage, your mortgage costs doubled easily, and the economy has come through this strong. I mean, those of us who were on the team transitory side, who thought there was maybe a good scenario here, a Goldilocks scenario, we don't need to get into the weeds of this, but broadly speaking, our best hopes came true, right? That you could live through a definite surge in prices. In the US case, it was a proper inflationary surge, quite widely based, unlike in Europe, where it was very sectional. It went out broad, you raised monetary policy interest rates, and you did not have a disastrous increase in unemployment. It's barely blipped above full employment levels. It's barely blipped at all. And we've had this extraordinary, from a social equality point of view, remarkable catch-up of lower income Americans, which has reversed that big historic shock in inequality that we saw in the 70s and 80s, which is the basis for the Piketty story. So it's like it's win, 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 win. The corporate sector is going strong. There's the great AAS story, which is driving the S&P to record levels. That's the amazing thing here. I don't think the argument is really about a percentage point in growth here or there. It's the fact that you could go through the COVID shock, come out the other side, live through the price surge, and then level out somewhere like where we are right now. And that is, it's a little head-turning, really, in terms of macroeconomic policy.
Yeah, and inflation is remaining sticky. There's some maybe worry about the job market a little bit. That might allow the Fed to essentially cut earlier than later, but I think the consensus is higher for longer. What do you think, Graham?
So I think there's no question that what we've seen in the past year has surprised almost everybody. So if you were to go back a year, 75% of the market was betting there's going to be a hard landing. So a lot of what you have as the euphoria or enthusiasm about the American economy is expectations of what was going to be a disaster that were escaped.
Yeah.
And I think I would emphasize that even more than the positives. So a big part of what we're seeing is that a serious recession, which should by all of the regularities of economics have occurred, didn't occur. Now, why not? We're still trying to figure that out. That's complicated. But I would say I'm struck by the extent to which there's enthusiasm about the American economic performance relative to everybody else. Well, to which the answer is, well, okay, as compared to the Europeans who've gone nowhere,
yeah,
it's kind of like a race between the lame and somebody that's able to move along with one foot. China, in contrast, is regarded as having had an unsuccessful year last year, but it only grew twice as fast as the U.S. And again, I think that's to do with expectations, the expectation that there would be some more stimulus, some bigger bounce back. That didn't occur. So I would look at it and say, first, thank goodness, amazing. But secondly, as we try to pick apart the pieces, how sustainable, well, complicated, and we go from there, yeah.
I mean, I think this perspective of comparison is fascinating, and if you add in the expectations element, it's like the reality plus the expectation, and you compare the two. In defense of the Europeans, there's a war. And they suffered an absolutely horrendous energy shock. I mean, China had electricity supply problems in 21-22, which it powered through. Yeah. The Europeans are not in a position to do that. They have this critical dependency on imported gas, and they've survived. In the way this plays out in economic terms was not that anything shut down, because they've got purchasing power. They went and bought everyone else's LNG. If you're Pakistan or Bangladesh, you're in trouble. But the terms of trade shock to the European economy accounts for a very large part of the difference. Whereas the US, and this is a factor we really have to reckon with, like everyone's focused on AI, But another key element of the US is the fossil fuel story.
Yes.
And America has become, and it's a historic shift in what was supposed to be a green presidency, the world's preeminent fossil fuel producer. So large parts of the US economy, the size of Texas, which is in economic terms roughly the size of Italy, suffer a huge positive terms of trade gain at that moment. There are other bits of the US which do worse, where Graham lives up in the northeast. The gas prices went up as well, but nowhere near to European levels. So there are these offsetting global effects, and the United States has kind of been on a sweet spot in a lot of them. Not, as Graham correctly says, we're not in China levels, but for a society, for a country of America's level of development, the pace of growth is pretty remarkable.
I think on Adam's point, I agree completely. And it's, again, reminds you of the wonderful ironies. So Biden is actually quite anti-drilling and producing hydrocarbons. Biden is perceived by the hydrocarbon companies as even more anti. So they are one of the strongest groups trying to defeat him currently. And yet we've never seen, as Adam has written about and was just mentioning, such an amazing increase. And the reason I would say is when you get a big technology advance and you get oil prices, or at this level, you've had a group incented. But then there's been a quite remarkable response, and that's been a big part of the American story.
It's understandable to a certain degree as well, though, with the war in Ukraine that causing the European energy shock, but also turmoil and war in Gaza and in some trouble in the Middle East. Yeah. So obviously it behooves the U.S. perhaps to continue to drill.
I think in terms of the confidence shocks, we have to differentiate. I mean, the Gaza imbroglio is a nightmare for American policy in general, specifically in the region. All of the promises of normalization of relations between Saudi and Israel, which are the prize of American policy, are kind of off the table for now. But it doesn't compare as a shock to confidence with what's happened to Europe. I mean, Europe really has lost the perspective. There are two big axes of globalization that matter for European business, of which we have prominent representatives here. And one of them was the relationship with Russia, and the other one was the relationship with China. And for certain key players, it's both at the same time, right? And both of those axes of geoeconomic alignment are problematic at this point. Now, the Germans are thick-skinned on some issues, and they'll just power on through, and their commitment to China is pretty rock-ribbed. But Russia's huge violence in Ukraine. And any moral equivalence here is completely specious. Russia is breaking international law in a most egregious way, and that has made it very, very difficult for corporate Europe. And it wasn't just the Germans, the French oil internationals are in there in a really big way as well. They've all taken this very huge hit. And I think that can't be underplayed in terms of what Keynes would have called the animal spirits of European business. This ain't good for animal spirits. This is a very ugly scenario, and it's set to get worse.
Is this your wheelhouse, the geopolitics of oil?
Yes, I would say that Adam's right on. If you look at the German situation, it's the most dramatic. They had become accustomed to the idea that they could have relatively cheap gas through Nord Stream 1 and then what was supposed to come Nord Stream 2. And that was a big part of their kind of industrial strategy. And that's now gone. And for gas, similarly, but then in addition, if you look at BP, or if you look at the French oil companies, or you look at the Italian oil company, they also are not now be able to do their business in Russia. So the consequence of that for kind of their activity has been a very, very cold bath.
Let's bring it back to the United States as well, and part of the energy equation is EVs, and it's in the news a lot right now. Obviously, the Germans are here trying to negotiate a way around maybe retaliatory sanctions from the Chinese if they do go ahead with those 48% tariffs on EVs. We already know the Biden administration upping the tariffs on Chinese EVs to over 100%. I mean, has David Fickling, who's a Bloomberg columnist with us, he basically said that Detroit perhaps has lost its will on EVs, on the electrification of the automobile industry. Would you agree with that? How would you say that they're not doing, the U.S. economy is not playing its part to curb greenhouse gas effects?
Well, yes, and it gets in complicated layer. So let me try to go quick. So first, if you were, U.S. Automobile companies lost their way a long time ago. So if you were, number two, if you were head of a U.S. oil company now, how like a U.S. auto company, you may be in an EV world with Biden, you may be in a completely different world in 6 months. So it's pretty hard to make big capital investments on the basis of uncertainty of that sort. And so they're hedging in a significant way. So next, China has an extremely competitive and extremely successful EV set of companies. You're familiar with them here. I mean, the thing about BYD, which is Buffett's been backing right from the beginning, BYD produces EVs at something like a third the price of their American competitors. So they'll be able to sell even into Europe with a huge tariff and still make money.
Yeah.
So why is that the case? Well, now we can go through lots and lots of reasons. The U.S. is blaming them mainly for subsidies for the front end of that. I'm dubious about that. I think largely this has been a success of a highly competitive environment in China for EVs. But as this comes to the U.S., for U.S., between the UAW and the auto companies, we were located in 3 of the critical states. That's a pillar of the Democratic Party that Biden cannot dismiss in any way.
Jobs in an election year.
It's jobs, and therefore, surprise, huge sanctions. So I think this is, particularly in product areas in which the combination of the unions and the companies will be politically powerful enough to impact the government, you'll see nationalist protectionism, and this, I think, is an example.
And it's like a double disconnect, right? Because if you talk about the auto industry in the United States today, it isn't Detroit anymore. The United States moved in the 90s from being a Detroit-centered auto complex
Austin, Texas,
to being a global hub for auto manufacturing with Europeans and Asian players in the United States space. The thing about those plants is they're not unionized, they're not part of the UAW Midwestern Classic complex, right? So when we talk about auto industry policy in the United States, you shouldn't confuse it with a national champions kind of model we see in Europe, or for that matter in China. Because the United States is really just the zone where people make cars, and it's really a North American zone. And the second confusion is the political confusion, whereby the auto worker, the person making the car, has this huge political salience in the United States as emblematic of the so-called good-paying middle-class jobs. Detroit, the Treaty of Detroit in the 1950s made the affluent American working class into middle-class people. And so it has this totemic significance. And I think Biden's age matters here. This is how he understands a good America, right? And in fact, the American working class is predominantly female, quite diverse, and works in the service sector, and doesn't really have very much to do with this sector. And what those people need is cheap cars. And those cheap cars are not made by American companies anymore. Ford doesn't make any small vehicles. It only makes trucks. It makes all its money on Ford F-150s, right? Cheap working class Americans have been buying Asian cars, mainly manufactured in Mexico, for a very long time. If they're ever going to go EV, it has to be BYD or other Chinese equivalents that meet a similar market. There's a big bit of the American market which is essentially emerging market in terms of its purchasing power, if it's buying new vehicles. And so there's this weird double disconnect in which policy is about the American industry and we say it's Detroit, whereas in fact auto industry is the whole thing. And it's about the American working class who don't make cars anymore. And yet we're in this sort of dead angle between the two. But Graham's absolutely right. For the politics of 3 swing states and facing Donald Trump, who appeals in the same way to the same warped reality, this politics really matters.
So what does a Trump presidency, a redux of his presidency, mean for the U.S. economy? I mean, I've talked to a lot of Biden officials, and they like to say that the action that they've taken on the trade front with China only accounts for about 4% of overall trade between China and the United States, and it's at the high end.
Small yard, high fence.
Yeah, exactly. That's what Jake Sullivan, I think, has coined that terminology. But again, Donald Trump has talked about, maybe it's just electioneering and politicking ahead of the election, but 60% across the board tariffs on all Chinese products. What does a new tariff regime like this that we've seen in the past, Graham, pre-World War II, tariffs were the way to get revenue. Is this way the United States is heading?
So again, the first thing to say about Trump is he's unpredictable. The second thing is that he's erratic. Erratic.
Okay.
Peter Thiel has a good line about him. He says, the problem with people trying to interpret Trump is that they take him literally, but not seriously. And that's ass backwards. You should take him seriously and not literally, okay? So complicated to interpret. I think he's said frequently enough now in enough different settings, and in particular, Lighthizer, who Trump says is his man for tariffs and trade.
Robert Lighthizer.
Robert
yes.
Lighthizer, who was the trade representative in the first administration. Lighthizer actually written a book about this, so you can see his theory of the case. Lighthizer will be determined to do everything he can to eliminate any deficit in the trade between the U.S. and China. And he'll start, he says, with 50% tariffs or 75% tariffs. He has another scheme for doing this. It's actually one that Buffett had designed earlier to say that if you want to import anything, you have to have a certificate for having exported $1 worth of something, and then you could have a market in those. Again, it'll be another level of inefficiency in a trade set of arrangements. But I could easily imagine Trump attempting to do something like what he said. Now, what would the impact of that be? Well, initially, obviously, it'll be inflationary.
Well, that's
and
what
if the inflationary impact.
So
when I go to Home Depot or Walmart to buy my stuff, and it costs more, I'm going to complain, and if the inflation is growing in the U.S., that's going to be uncomfortable. So then maybe people will think again and say, how do I, adapt or adjust? So I would say, could be quite turbulent. And if you put on top of that, the other thing that I think it's highly likely Trump will do, which is seal the southern border. Well, then there's 2.5 million people coming illegally into the U.S. currently every year, 2.5 million. So 50,000 people every month come. About 2/3 of them encounter somebody. They ask them, "What are you doing?" If you've kind of crossed the river or come under a fence, "I'm seeking asylum." They say, "Okay, here's an assignment. You should show up here," and then they release them into the U.S. So those 2.5 million people are going to be backing up in Mexico, okay? And even he says he's going to be rounding up illegals and expelling them.
But that's inflationary as well.
That'll be inflation, but it will also be chaotic.
Yeah.
I was going to say, inflation might be the least of our worries at that point.
I'm a business guy.
And then if you try to think about trade between the U.S. and Mexico, which happens to be our #1 trading partner right now, okay, that's going to be complicated because many companies have imagined that because there's a free trade agreement between the U.S. and Mexico, you can have a plant operating in Mexico that sells things without tariffs into the U.S.
Yeah.
But in those circumstances, so I would say 2 areas in which hold your breath.
Yeah.
But staggeringly, American business, as we read in Bloomberg amongst other sources, is actually increasingly opening its mind to the possibility of a Trump presidency, looking at the polling. If you're a realist, you want to, above all, back the winning horse. There is serious money flying from notionally serious people in American business his way in the face of the promise, at least, as you say, you don't really know what will deliver, but the willingness to openly contemplate policies that will be hugely disruptive to America's existing economic model. It is, for me, really a test case of the rationality of capital, the sort of folks that sit in this room here. If given a free choice between a Biden administration and a Trump administration, the Trump option at some point becomes one that you feel you have to back. It's it's a real test, I think, of the ability to ride above the immediate short-term pressure and to understand what strategic long-term interests might be. I don't think the race is lost yet. If the race was lost, you could say this makes perfect sense. You slide to the other side. You could say you should hedge, but we're not seeing hedging so much as people literally saying, I prefer the Trump agenda. It's where I think we should be at.
To play the devil's advocate, that risk scenario is not being played out in the markets right now.
No.
No, it's extraordinary.
At all. I mean, but the markets are all saying there's a little bit too much heat in AI.
Yeah.
So the markets have come back over the last few sessions, $400 billion knocked off NVIDIA.
Yeah.
That's more of a risk to this growth trajectory, at least on the markets, than a Trump presidency.
And I mean, we are talking about, after all, I mean, one way of doing this would be to say, look, the more dangerous scenario from a political point of view is that Biden wins. The political outcome is less predictable if Biden is actually declared a numerical winner, because we cannot predict, I think, the way in which the Trump-led GOP will respond to that. It's no longer a Mitch McConnell-dominated party, as it still was to a degree in Congress at the end of 2020. Mitch McConnell, in the end, took the decision to call it Biden's way. We do not, I think, have real confidence that that's how this is going to play out this time. So from a market point of view, purely interested in stability, if you like, in getting through this moment of transition in one piece, you could see maybe why the Trump option appears more straightforward, because the only way to ensure that a spoiled child doesn't throw a tantrum is to give the spoiled child what it wants. If you actually simply run a process and produce a different outcome, I just don't know that we know how we should go.
Graham, I don't think you're too much of a fan of Donald Trump. I saw an interview 2017. You were asked by Bloomberg, what do you think Donald Trump, this was 2017, what would Donald Trump do, or what would his reaction be if he read your book? And you said, well, I don't think he reads.
I think that's well attested. I don't think that's a speculation. That's
just a fact. No,
it's just a fact. Yeah.
That doesn't mean that he doesn't learn or that he's not smart. That's certainly right. And I think back to explaining part of, I agree with Adam's point that there's so many things here that don't make sense. So does it make sense that the market seems as confident as it is? If it's even half of the uncertainties that we're talking about, that would seem to be like, and now maybe that'll end up showing up. But the other part of this, I think, is that, for internationals that are trying to understand this, I think most of the best political analysts say this will not be a contest between people who are in favor of either the candidate A or candidate B for whom they vote. What will determine their vote is that they like the other candidate even worse. Yeah. So the people who are voting for Trump, many of them, have decided that Biden has so badly lost his way with a woke agenda, with a border that's out of control, with a vice president who's not competent to serve. They got 19 reasons why you can't possibly choose B. And then not wondering about A. And the people who are preferring B say, well, look at this guy, A. This is completely insane. You can't think of this. You can't. So it's a contest between two candidates. Two-thirds of Americans think neither of them should be their candidates.
Why is there such a disconnect? I haven't lived in the United States for 34 years, so I'm not quite in tune. I don't have my finger on the pulse of why there's so much dissatisfaction when there is such a strong economy and record highs of the S&P. It's the economy, stupid, is the old mantra.
Yeah, one of the really amazing things about the US right now is the degree to which assessments of people's personal life. Did you catch the question?
Vera Songway here.
It's up to you now.
We've saved 3 hard questions, so we're over to you.
I'm going to pass them all back, but thank you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'll bring you in.
We're doing the disconnect. Why is it that Americans say they feel so bad when in fact all the data say
well, the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey recently, 7-month low. So they seem to be dissatisfied. Inflation has been stubbornly high.
The Michigan one's interesting. There's some really interesting gender data on it. It oversamples men. And that means that they're particularly sensitive to particular types of prices. So the Michigan survey data is super sensitive to the petrol price, because that's the only price many men know. Whereas the conference board uses a much broader panel and produces slightly less wild variation.
Okay.
But
So why this disconnect?
the crucial thing, I think, is that both of those show massive partisanship. So the day after the election, watch those confidence data, and it is literally true that the day after, the losing side will judge their personal economic circumstances to be anything up to 15 to 20 percentage points worse than the day before the election when their political hopes hadn't been dashed.
Yeah.
So there is there's a loss of, as it were, unpolitical reality. Now, you could say, of course, that no, this is perfectly realistic. You believe that everything's at stake and America will go to the dogs as soon as the other party wins. Yeah. But that's not borne out by any data or actually any real experience, right? So the Republicans, so that's one element. The other one is, I think, is that America is an incredibly unequal society. And it's quite difficult to live there for many people. And those who've gotten caught on the wrong side of the interest rate hike and the wrong side of the inflation shock in the bits of the US economy that are growing less fast have reason in the data that's hidden by the averages to feel much more miserable about the way they're doing.
So I've got part of the answer to the puzzle, and then I think Adam had the other part there. So the first, Greg Ip had a wonderful chart, and I don't know if we're allowed to mention the competition here.
Sure.
The Wall Street Journal, okay. So
sure.
In which, even though if you do household wealth during the Biden administration, nominally people are 20% wealthier. In real terms, they've not grown at all.
Yep.
Okay, that's a kind of a shocking. When I looked at it, I thought, this can't be right, so I looked into it. This is correct. But then the second thing is, Adam puts a point even stronger, stratify this between the top 1%, 5%, 10%, and the two-thirds or the 75%. You get completely different worlds. So you and I know what's happened to the index markets. Yeah. Most Americans say, polls over and over, that markets have gone down. It's because they have no connection to markets. They don't own any stocks. I said at Davos in January, as I had said the year before, NVIDIA. I think NVIDIA is a good idea.
Just not for the last week.
How many people own NVIDIA? You know some people that own NVIDIA. Yeah. I know some people. 80% of Americans, they've heard that there's something NVIDIA. They don't know what it is. So the Magnificent Seven, which account for a huge amount of the increase that one's seen in the market, are ones that a few people, 10% of the people may participate in, but not most of them. So I think Adam's point that there's quite a lot of people who have a different experience.
Yeah. Vera, welcome. Hi.
Thank you. Hi.
I'm Stephen Engel from Bloomberg TV. Nice to see you. So you've missed a lot. So you have that advantage or disadvantage in this conversation.
Disadvantage.
How do you correct the record here? Yeah,
yeah right.
It's going to come in.
I guess the overarching question is, how do you see this year for the U.S. economy, given all the things that we've just talked about in an election year, which adds a lot of volatility, but again, potentially interest rate changes maybe by the end of the year. What do you see?
I'm not going to predict or do Jay Powell's job here for him, but I think two things, and before I come to that, exactly what you're saying is reflected in the global economy on globalization, right? With globalization, we kind of see a top tier that says, this is working for us, we like it very much. And then there is a bottom under that is saying, it didn't work for us and we need something different. So one can really just pull out, we have the celebration of East Asia and the miracle, which was trade. And then we have the rest, or today, what we see in Europe as a reaction to that, that's saying globalization didn't work for anybody. I think in terms of interest rates, and for the developing world, it is even more important because with US interest rates at 5.5, the developing world is going to the market at 8 and 10, right? And so we necessarily need to see that go down. And until those rates go down, it's very difficult to see the rest of the world grow. And so it is in everybody's interest, I think, to make sure that one, we can stabilize those interest rates, but we have a competing tension, which is monetary policy and fiscal policy. We have fiscal policy that is, and I don't know if you spoke about this before, that is creating so many stimuluses, some of them good to some extent, like the IRA or the infrastructure bill, the student forgiveness loan. All of these are, fiscal stimuluses that are getting into the system and making sure that Jay Powell's job is a little bit more difficult because he can bring down those costs. We are seeing supply chain constraints because of the Suez Canal, because of what's happening in Brazil with the drying up of the Rio Negre, and so that is causing price tensions. And so essentially we are in a space where we have not really been before, where you have both demand and supply side constraints, but you also have fiscal policy and monetary policy in the largest economy in the world acting at loggerheads with each other, right, to some extent. And I think exactly as you said, Adam, post-election, maybe some of this will go down. The benefit of some of the fiscal policy, particularly the IRA, is that it is going to business people who are normally on the other side of the aisle, and a huge benefit, $600 and something billion that are going for climate innovation, which we hope eventually will benefit the rest of the world. And I think that is where there is a hope that we're going to wait to see if it becomes realized. But my sense is that within the United States itself, some of that benefit, because some of it is in innovation, some of it is in technology, is not trickling down to where it needs to go. Hence, the reaction that says we are not feeling as good as the numbers are telling us that we do. And I'm a Wolverine, so sometimes we also look at the women. And Wolverine means University of Michigan.
So it leads to the next question. I want to also leave some time for some questions. Because we're in China, and I do cover China extensively, and I've covered quite a bit about the tariff regime and also the export controls and all that. What's your general top-down view as far as the effect of that? I mean, the Biden administration likes to talk about it as being supply chain resiliency. They're friend-shoring. IRA is part of friend-shoring, attracting investment to the United States, moving chips from TSMC to Kumamoto, Japan, on all these moves to kind of de-risk from China. But it's going to be inflationary for one, and it's going to, as Li Qiang, the premier today, said, it's going to lead to a destructive cycle of decoupling, which doesn't sound good to me. What are your thoughts?
I think if we agree that the climate crisis is a crisis, that the world is on fire, then the economists in us would say, go to those who have the best, quickest, easiest, fastest solution, and the cheapest solution, by the way. The reason why most of us are going to solar panels today is because the Chinese invested hugely in the cost of solar panels and the price crashed, and so everybody can afford solar panels. So I think that if there is one area where we need global cooperation and global collaboration, it is in the energy sector. If we are trying to do clean steel, if we're trying to do clean housing, if we're trying to do clean cement, we do need to make sure that we can collaborate with the people that are building the houses and so it's India, it's China, it's Indonesia, that essentially need to come together with the United States to do that. Having, I think, that competition, when Spain was producing solar panels, the rest of the developing world, Africa included, was not able to afford solar panels, which is the case today for windmills, by the way. Windmills are not as cheap because they are not being mass produced and there hasn't been a huge market absorption of them. And my fear is that if we have these kinds of tariff policies, we don't get to huge absorption of electric vehicles or EV buses or two-wheelers or battery storage systems that we need.
I mean, that's the Liu Junmin, the Chinese climate envoy, essentially told me that if there's any product in the world that needs cheaper prices for climate change, it's those green technologies, right? But the walls are going up, obviously, especially in EVs. But you had something to say.
Yeah, there's a sort of strange, slightly kind of hall of mirrors feeling to many of these issues right now, in that there is this big ticket IRA program. And if you ask hard, like how much has actually been spent and how much investment's actually happening, most people say, well, nothing yet. It's coming down the pipeline, and maybe it will, maybe it won't. It depends on the Trump administration. And the main stimulus is coming actually from the price effect. So the reason why we're getting the big rollout in Texas is not for IRA money, but because it's already cheap, because the Chinese have helped to make it cheap. So there's this sort of weird tension between the elevated and escalating rhetoric. The same is true for America's trade deficit. The trade deficit's not shrunk, and Chinese manufactured exports are not going down. So you put those two and two together and you know what's actually going on. It's not going via direct from China to the US, it's going through a multitude of other channels, and it's just being, it's been shifted. And yet American politics can play this weird game, like I was saying earlier on, where you talk about an industry which doesn't exist anymore and workers who don't do what you say they do, and then you say that you're kind of serving their needs. You're doing a national trade policy. We're not actually seeing much effect yet. Now, if you go to the sort of tariffs that Trump is talking about across the board, no exceptions, these are kind of shock effects. But as somebody who's trying to gauge the relative momentum of a democracy in policy making as against other political regimes in the world, notably China, of course, you have to ask yourself, where's the juice? Where's the beef, actually? Same goes for elaborate development policy. When America makes promises to do various types of blended or leveraged finance for the developing world, it sounds like a good scheme. We see the architecture laid out, and then, in fact, do the tens or hundreds of billions. Once upon a time, we talked about billions to trillions. Does it ever materialize? No, it tends not to. So there's this sort of strange feeling of, yeah, kind of like a hall of mirrors. You see it, and then it's there, and then you look for it, and you try and grab it, and actually it's over there somewhere in another scheme that hasn't quite been realized yet. And I worry about the credibility of democratic policy making in these terms. You know, we do big stimulus, fiscal, monetary, but all this other stuff is quite empty.
When I teach about this in my class, I call it fantasy policy.
Yeah. I mean, when you put a lot of tariffs on, does it create or re-stimulate industry that is already lost in America?
No.
No.
No, you don't grow a new industry with a tariff. You incentivize smart people who want to import another way. Yeah. Conceivably, people who already know how to do this, if they want, will tariff jump and decide to do FDI. That would also be a logic, but that doesn't necessarily result in much technology transfer, because basically they're just tariff jumping. I've spoken to Chinese executives here who've tried to build photovoltaic plants in Texas. It's an uphill battle because you don't have the supply chain, don't have the necessary labor, and apparently it's really hard to persuade Chinese workers to actually immigrate to the United States right now to train an American workforce. So, you know, no, it doesn't easily translate. I think something new that is happening,
though, is that with the IRA, there has been an understanding that you need maybe some cross-border partnerships. And so the IRA has expanded a little bit to include, you know, Canada and Mexico. And so some technology transfer is beginning to happen that is leaving the US and going to, you know, periphery geographies. We are arguing, of course, that it should include Africa and maybe further afield places which have some of the materials that are needed. But I think in terms of spending on the IRA, at least if you listen to the Department of Energy's data, I think over half of those resources have been spent in red states already. And so there is some investment and some certainty that the IRA will not go away because there is a change in administration because of precisely where some of the investments are happening and who is benefiting from them.
I've hogged the whole thing. 4 minutes left for questions. Do we have any urgent questions? Limited to one question, quick one. Anyone? No? Yep, over here.
Hi, thank you for a very engaging conversation. Very quickly, November, Trump comes to power. Yeah. He does what he says he do. Inflation goes up, tariff goes up. What happens to the dollar?
What happens to what?
The US dollar.
I was just going to ask about the dollar, of course. You read my mind. King dollar obviously has been in place. There's been a great yield differential. The yen is 160, dollar going strong, renminbi at 7.2. What's going to happen to the dollar?
I mean, basic econ would tell you the dollar adjusts to offset the effect of the tariff, and then two different branches of the Trump administration tear themselves apart over wanting the tariff and wanting a weak dollar. And the more tariff you do, the stronger the dollar gets, and then you kind of drive yourself crazy, and Robert Lighthizer kind of spins up in a, puff of smoke. No, I mean, I think it would be it's a genuine tension. Those two options just don't go together. They would love it both ways. I think they've indicated a preference for the tariff route rather than dollar devaluation, which has also been on the agenda. The wildest talk around the Trump camp is some move on the independence of the Fed,
Yes.
which they've disowned, but, you know, who knows? It's very difficult to read.
But the other part that has been seriously discussed, and actually you can read about this, is that they will do a plaza-like forcing realignments of currencies, in particular with China. So again, that's...
But you know, I think when the euro was created, this was part of the conversation, right? It has taken 25 years and the euro has not moved more than 20% of world trade. 60% of world trade is still done in the dollar. Eventually it may, you know, reduce, but I think it will take another 60 years maybe for that to happen as geopolitics changes. My sense is that in some sense we collectively have invested in the sort of trust of the dollar. A currency exists because people trust and have confidence in its ability to be a store of value. And today, I think the dollar serves that purpose the best.
And the efforts of de-dollarization have not panned out.
No.
Through quantitative easing, it did not collapse. Through tightening, obviously, it's attracted.
We're all hurting. It doesn't mean that we're not hurting because we use it, but it stays as, I think, the currency that allows the best for exchange.
More questions? We're getting a little bit of an extended period of time. Yes, down here. There's a microphone.
My question is for Alex and Professor Allison. I think you have been talking about Thucydides. I don't know the exact pronunciation of that.
Thucydides trap.
Are you still holding your idea now? And how will the two countries going out of the trap?
That's when a rising power poses a threat to an established power that eventually leads to conflict.
So the answer is yes. So basically, China will continue, I believe, to be a rapidly rising power. The U.S. will continue to be a colossal ruling power. When a rapidly rising power seriously threatens to displace a major ruling power, that shift in the tectonics basically disturbs all the rest of relations between other countries and other dimensions. So I would say, as I wrote in this book, this is again at the beginning of the Trump administration, in U.S.-China relations, expect things to get worse before they get worse. And I would say that's still a good prediction. Now, does the fact that you have that rivalry inevitably mean that it will end in a war? And the answer is no.
But the book title is called Destined for War.
And then it says, can the U.S. and China escape Thucydides' trap? Question mark. So in 4 of the 16 cases that I discussed in the book in the last 500 years, there was no war. So even if you were just doing and looking at the record, there have been cases in which you have a rapidly rising power seriously threatening a ruling power in which there was not a war. What this does is, I believe, correctly describe the diagnose, the challenge. Business as usual, or statecraft as usual, will give you history as usual. But that's the challenge, to reach beyond business as usual, beyond statecraft as usual. And interestingly, Xi Jinping has picked up on this and has been trying to think in this space. His proposition currently about, as he puts it, I am in you and you are in me, describes a degree of interdependence between two countries in which, if for objective reasons, my survival requires a degree of cooperation with you, and for example, if we happen to live in an enclosed biosphere, and if either of our greenhouse gas emissions on old trajectories could make it unlivable for both of us, then survival requires finding a way to reach a degree of coordination and cooperation.
Well, Adam, I think you will have a comment on this. I mean, Janet Yellen has talked about the Thucydides trap. But it's interesting, and one of the quotes, and I think I'm quoting this from your article in Foreign Policy that you wrote. She said, China's economic growth need not be incompatible with U.S. economic leadership. That's assuming that the United States has to remain as the economic leader, right?
I mean, it's a measure of this now I'm going to add like it's more like a haunted house than a fun house of mirrors. It's like Janet Yellen is so within the frame of Graham's Thucydides trap that she actually gave this speech last year in which she said, don't worry, the Thucydides trap we're going to escape because America is going to outgrow China, in which case China never overtakes the United States and war is off. I mean, the astonishing implication of that is that were an American statesperson to gather that China were going to overtake the United States, they fully agree that it would be time for preventive war. But no, don't worry, there's actually a way in which China can go on growing without actually never actually challenging the United States. And so really, peace and calm, folks, peace and calm, it's all going to be good. But I mean, and this is explicitly articulated by the most senior, and after all, Janet Yellen belongs to the most dovish and most cooperative elements in the Biden administration. She's really a hangover from the 1990s amongst the younger generation that's much tougher, right? The Jake Sullivans of this world. And she is still framing her optimistic message in terms of this very dark scenario. And I find that, I mean, what is not contemplated is a new model of great power relations. The thing that cannot be said is the possibility that in a truly multipolar world, the notion of American leadership as number one, as the top hierarch, is simply obsolete and out of date. And that is the one thing that is essentially, Graham is one of the few people, I think, who still, with any authority, can articulate this position in Washington, D.C. That's why he's truly important in the current moment as a voice, because that's the unsayable thing. All the other arguments have to be within this frame of, no, we're not going to fall into the trap, because actually the United States is doing so well that China will never overtake it. I mean, it's a dead end.
We only have about a minute left, and what I always like to do on these panels is, because I can never get to every possible angle, I never ask the right questions or anything, but you probably came prepared to say something. What is your main takeaway from the theme of the panel is the U.S. economy, where does it go? Is there something else that you wanted to add? Vera, I can begin with you and then go down the line.
No, I mean, I think for the global economy, the U.S. economy needs to continue growing because we need it in some sense to pull the rest up. However, it must recognize that its growth depends on the others growing as well. And in that recognition, I think lies a lot of the conversations we're having today in terms of sourcing minerals, whether from Africa or otherwise, and also sharing innovation so that we can collectively grow together. I think this, for me, is the heart of the conversation. It's not aid in some sense. We're happy that the U.S. is growing. The rest of the world can grow with it. But I think the policies that are being put in place to make sure that the rest grow with it are not fully there yet.
Graham, do you have anything else?
So I'm excited about the ways in which the next waves of technologies may actually produce another set of wonders. AI is obviously an example. I think in synthetic biology and genomics is another arena. So I can imagine that we're going to see, as we're seeing now, a burst of enthusiasm in the U.S. and actually applications of it in ways that will be very positive for the U.S. economy and then ultimately for the global economy. So I would say that part is hopeful. And I'm quite hopeful about the way in which Chinese companies driving competitive efforts against each other in green technologies have managed to drive prices down to levels that would have been thought inconceivable otherwise for solars, but also for EVs. How can BYD make a very nice EV for $10,000? Yeah, it's a, you say, well, so maybe if we have more of that in more domains, more. So if I try to be optimistic, that's where I'd go. Yeah.
I usually leave the last word in my household to the ladies of the panel, but you have the last word. Sorry.
That's great. I think the policy, I'm kind of with Jason Furman on this, the policy in the United States needs to be about the livelihood and well-being of the average American, the median American, not the numerical average. And the single statistic around which American policy should be orientated, and it's absolutely not, is the fact that in 2018, well before COVID, China overtook the United States in terms of healthy life expectancy for adults. The life expectancy of a black man born in the United States today is lower than in Rwanda. Right? The priority of American economic policy, above all things, should be actually about expanding the prosperity that the elite in the country enjoy to such an abundant extent. And that means economic policy that's actually centered on the care sector, on childcare, on health, on well-being, on nutrition, on affordable housing. It's not a global race in the industrial space, which is important and leads us into new technological spaces we need to go into. But if we were actually interested not just in stabilizing American society, but stabilizing American democracy, in other words, giving American citizens the sense of full share of a society that really worked well, which it doesn't for many Americans, this would be the things that we would focus on. Livable cities, affordable childcare, general and comprehensive healthcare, and elder care, the basics. And the interesting thing is that's also the policy recommendation you would make to Beijing, right? China does industrial policy brilliantly and has, in a sense, sucked the entire world into focusing on what you do so brilliantly. But all of us have been diverted away from an agenda that actually addresses to a considerable extent that softer dimension. But for increasingly prosperous societies, these are the things that ultimately matter most. It's an agenda of care. And it was there in the Green New Deal. It was killed in Congress. But it's a terrible victim of a narrowing political process.
Yep. I've seen it personally last week. My 96-year-old mother. No health care, it's paperwork, paperwork, paperwork. And she's had a stroke and has a dementia, but that's for next year. We'll talk about that. Ladies and gentlemen, we're done. Thank you so much.